My name is Ibrahim Traoré, and what I'm about to share will change everything you think you know about global power. 3 weeks ago, in the stillness of the night, my phone rang. The call lasted exactly 47 minutes. The man on the other end spoke flawless English, but I could hear the fear behind his voice. And here's the shock. It wasn't Washington, Paris, or London calling. It was Beijing. President Traore. He said, "We need to discuss your recent partnerships with African Americans. These alliances you're building are raising serious concerns among those who have invested heavily in Africa's future." That single phone call confirmed something I had long suspected. For the last 20 years, while America turned away from Africa and Europe, clung to colonial habits, China quietly took over as Africa's largest trading partner. They built roads, railways, and ports. They invested in factories, funded infrastructure, and convinced us they were different from the West. But what I discovered is that their model was not partnership. It was dependency. I realized this 5 years ago as a young officer at a security conference in Ghana. During a break, I overheard 2 Chinese officials speaking in Mandarin, not knowing I could understand. One complained about African demands for technology transfer and local hiring. The other replied, "Don't worry. Africans are excellent at consuming but terrible at innovating. They'll always need us to build their infrastructure and manage their resources. The key is to keep them dependent." That sentence opened my eyes. China's entire strategy in Africa was never about shared growth. It was economic colonialism, carefully designed to bind us with Chinese loans, Chinese workers, Chinese technology, and Chinese control. When countries can't repay, they seize the infrastructure. They call it the Belt and Road Initiative. I call it the Debt and Control Initiative. But there's one thing Beijing never saw coming. They assumed Africa would forever be desperate for outside help. What they didn't expect was the awakening of 50 million African Americans, carrying 1.6 trillion in purchasing power and centuries of innovation experience, remembering their roots and choosing to return home. That's when the cracks began to show. 6 months ago, a Chinese state-owned company had been negotiating for years to build a telecommunications network across West Africa. They spent millions lobbying, funding studies, and securing allies. They were certain the contract was theirs. Then Marcus Johnson happened. Marcus, an African-American software engineer, partnered with local tech firms in Nigeria, Ghana, and Burkina Faso. Instead of importing Chinese systems, we chose to build our own, using African-American expertise and African innovation. That decision shook Beijing to its core. Marcus' team didn't just match China's capabilities. They surpassed them. They built systems that were more secure, more affordable, and better suited to African realities. Most importantly, they trained African engineers to maintain and upgrade those systems on their own, ending the cycle of dependence. When the telecommunications contract for West Africa was awarded not to a Chinese state giant, but to African companies backed by African-American expertise, Beijing was stunned. For the first time in 2 decades, China lost a major infrastructure deal in Africa, and not to Europe or the United States, but to Africans working hand in hand with their diaspora. That was the moment Chinese officials realized the competition had changed. They weren't just facing the West anymore. They were facing Africa itself. 2 months later, the invitation arrived. The Chinese government wanted me in Beijing for what they called an informal consultation about development cooperation. They offered first-class flights, luxury accommodations, and private meetings with their highest-ranking officials. I accepted, but not for the reasons they assumed. The meetings were unlike anything I had ever experienced with Western leaders. There were no lectures about democracy or human rights, no demands for political reforms. The Chinese went straight to business. President Traore, the foreign minister, began. China has invested over 200 billion in Africa over the past 20 years. We have built your roads, railways, ports, and power plants. We have provided loans when Western banks refused. We have created jobs when Western companies stayed away. Then came the real concern. But now, he said, we hear you are encouraging African Americans to invest in African infrastructure. We worry that such inexperienced diaspora involvement could disrupt carefully planned development strategies. I asked him what he meant by unexperienced. His answer revealed everything. President Traore, he said, African Americans may have found success in American technology and business, but they don't understand African conditions. They lack the scale, the resources, and the expertise to manage projects at the continental level. That was the moment it became clear China wasn't worried about African American inexperience. They were afraid of African American expertise. And on my second day in Beijing, something happened that exposed just how deep that fear runs. I was scheduled to meet with representatives from China's biggest corporations in Africa, mining firms, construction giants, telecom providers, and financial institutions. The meeting was supposed to last 2 hours. It stretched to 6, and every executive told me the same story, just with different details. African American professionals were arriving on the continent with skills, networks, and resources China couldn't match. And more than money, they were bringing knowledge that made African nations less dependent on Chinese solutions. A mining executive admitted, African American engineers are training local workers to operate equipment we thought only Chinese technicians could handle. They're making our presence less necessary. A telecom representative complained, they're helping African companies develop software that competes directly with ours. They're creating alternatives where we believed none existed. But the most revealing words came from a Chinese financial executive. African Americans understand both American market systems and African community needs. They're designing financial products that serve local populations better than anything we can offer. They're making Chinese financial services irrelevant. That's when I understood the truth. For 20 years, China had positioned itself as Africa's only escape from Western dependency. They convinced leaders that their partnership was our only path to modernization. But African Americans were proving there was another way, an African way, a path that combined African resources with African American expertise to create solutions independent of any foreign power. And that's when the pushback began. 3 weeks after I returned from Beijing, African countries with African American partnerships all started facing the same problems. Chinese-funded projects suddenly stalled. Loans that had been sailing through Chinese banks were put under review. Chinese companies pulled out of ventures that included African American partners. The trade agreements were the clearest message. Countries strengthening ties with African Americans found their Chinese trade deals rewritten. More restrictive, more expensive, more demanding. The choice was clear: Chinese dependency or African American partnership, but not both. That was the moment I realized we weren't just building partnerships. We were in an economic war for Africa's future. But Beijing had miscalculated. They assumed we would buckle under pressure, the way individual African nations had done in the past. They were wrong. The more China tried to squeeze, the stronger the alliance grew. African American investors who had once approached Africa cautiously now saw themselves as part of a global struggle for the continent's destiny. Professionals who thought they were just doing side projects began to view African partnerships as the defining work of their careers. Institutions that once treated Africa as charity started treating it as strategy. Dr. Kesha Williams, the renewable energy expert I mentioned before, said it best. When I first came to Africa, I thought I was just building solar panels. Now I realize I'm part of a movement to free Africa from energy dependency on any foreign power. And within months, what began as scattered individual partnerships evolved into a coordinated network. Investors prioritized African projects over global ones. Professionals shared resources, contacts, and strategies. Each success multiplied the impact of the next. Then came the breakthrough. The moment I believe history will mark as the beginning of Africa's true liberation from dependency. 6 months ago, Dr. Michael Thompson, an African-American cardiovascular surgeon, joined forces with our Ministry of Health to design African-led medical training programs. During one of our planning meetings, Dr. Thompson said something that lit a spark. President Traore, he told me, instead of building scattered partnerships between individual African nations and individual African American professionals, what if we built a continental network? What if every African American working in Africa was connected to every other? What if every African government partnering with the diaspora was linked to every other doing the same? That idea became the African Diaspora Development Network, the most ambitious Pan-African economic project of the modern era. Within 3 months, we had connected African American professionals across 23 countries. We linked governments that prioritized diaspora partnerships. We built communication channels, resource sharing systems, and coordination platforms that transformed isolated efforts into a unified movement. And in doing so, we created something China never anticipated, an economic bloc powerful enough to challenge their influence across the entire continent. Their response was immediate and desperate. First, they tried to outspend us, pouring in more investments, loosening loan terms, promising greater technology transfer. But they quickly discovered money couldn't buy what African Americans brought: cultural connection and genuine partnership. Then they tried to divide us. They offered African nations exclusive deals if they limited diaspora involvement. They dangled lucrative opportunities in Asia before African American entrepreneurs if they would scale back their work in Africa. When those tactics failed, they tried something else. I never thought I'd see it. They tried to copy us. Chinese companies began hiring African Americans as consultants, hoping to borrow our cultural bond. Their institutions launched scholarships for African American students, hoping to foster loyalty to Beijing. But what they couldn't replicate was authenticity. They couldn't fake the pride an African American feels when contributing to Africa's progress. They couldn't duplicate the sense of homecoming that drives the diaspora to give their best. They couldn't manufacture the family bond that makes our cooperation unbreakable. That's when I knew we had already won something far more important than contracts or investments. We had proven that authentic relationships are stronger than calculated interests. And the implications go beyond Africa. Every time Africa reduces its reliance on Chinese infrastructure, China's global influence shrinks. Every time African Americans choose Africa over other investment destinations, capital strengthens black communities instead of foreign powers. Every time African governments collaborate with diaspora expertise, they create models other developing nations can follow. But the most profound shift is psychological. For the first time in centuries, Africans on both sides of the Atlantic see ourselves not as dependents of foreign powers, but as partners in our own destiny. That is what truly terrifies China. Their entire strategy rests on the belief that Africans would always accept dependency as the price of development. They never imagined we would remember that we have family, with skills, resources, and networks. That makes dependency unnecessary. So, let me paint you the future they fear most. An Africa where every major infrastructure project is designed by African minds with African American expertise, and built by African workers empowered through technology transfer. Universities that stand shoulder to shoulder with the world's best, because African knowledge is fused with diaspora academic excellence. Companies that export finished goods, not raw resources, because they have African American business networks opening global markets. And African American communities that no longer look elsewhere, but see Africa as their primary destination for investment, innovation, and growth. Imagine African American professionals who see opportunities in Africa as more promising than those at home in the United States. Imagine African American institutions that place Africa at the center of their global partnerships instead of looking first to Asia or Europe. That's not just African development. That's the rise of a global black economic power center. One strong enough to rival China, Europe, or any other regional bloc in both economic influence and cultural impact. China has poured more than $200 billion into Africa over the past 2 decades, precisely to prevent this scenario. Yet, we are building it anyway, using resources and connections they never planned for and cannot replicate. And now we face a choice that will determine the future. Will Africa and African Americans step into our full potential, or continue allowing others to shape our destiny? China has already shown its choice. They will fight with every tool available: economic pressure, diplomatic influence, and strategic maneuvering to hold on to their dominance in Africa. But we have choices too. We can either bow to pressure and fall back into dependency, or we can strengthen our cooperation until we are too powerful to be pushed aside. We can either keep competing for space inside someone else's system, or we can build our own systems, ones that reflect our values, our dignity, and our vision for our children. This isn't just about economics. It's about identity, about self-determination, about the legacy we will leave. To my African American brothers and sisters, understand what your partnership with Africa really means. When you invest in Africa, you're not just chasing business opportunities. You are helping liberate 1.3 billion Africans from dependency on powers that have never put us first. When you share your skills and knowledge, you're not just teaching. You are proving that we can achieve anything on our own terms. When you choose Africa over other international ventures, you are shaping the most important shift in global power since the fall of colonialism. China understands what's at stake. That's why they are terrified. That's why they are working so hard to divide us. The question is, do you understand what's at stake? Do you see how your success in America has equipped you with tools that could transform Africa? Do you see how Africa's resources and potential can create opportunities that America has never given you? Let me leave you with a challenge. This is bigger than business, bigger than borders, bigger than individual achievement. We have the chance to show that scattered people can reunite, that centuries of separation can be healed, and that authentic cooperation is stronger than any outside force. We can prove that Black excellence isn't a rare exception to be celebrated. It's the very foundation on which civilizations can be built. This is exactly what China fears. They know that African resources combined with African American expertise could make their influence irrelevant. But I see something even greater. I see the possibility of a global Black unity that sparks not just economic independence, but also cultural rebirth, technological breakthroughs, and social transformation. Change that benefits all of humanity. The choice is in our hands. We can let fear of retaliation shrink our vision, or we can let our vision grow so vast that no one can contain it. My brothers and sisters, come home. Not because Africa needs saving, but because together we can save ourselves. Together, we can show the world what real partnership looks like. The future is calling, and the fact that China is afraid is proof that we are moving in the right direction. To everyone listening, know this: what we are building is larger than economics, larger than politics, larger than any single nation's agenda. We are proving that family bonds are stronger than strategic deals, that authentic cooperation will always outlast manufactured dependency, and that when Black people across continents stand together, we create possibilities that terrify those who profit from our separation. If this vision resonates with you, share it. Because this isn't just about Africa and America. This is about what happens when scattered people remember they were never truly divided.